think you'll agree that that was great value from those presentations. Really, a lot of food for thought on all sides. Obviously, we've got some great insights, and definitely, I want to kick off with something that pick up on something that you had to say, Sandile, where you were talking about the potential problem that we had with absolutism, and that 2004 was probably the high point and the closest that we came. The ANC at that point had polled nearly 70%. It was just a fraction short of that. They could have changed the constitution and done all kinds of things if they wanted to. There was no real opposition as such. I think at that point the DA was the official opposition with 14% of the vote. I mean, it's hard to remember that it was like that. The question that I want to ask you is that, did the ANC's internal ructions, the Polokwane debacle, the whole movement that ushered in Jacob Zuma, do you think in the long run that did South Africa a favor by heading off the potential absolutism?
Yeah, the short answer to that is...
Well, I think I'll switch it on there. Matthew? Hello?
So the short answer to that question is yes. But the more important issue there is that we as citizens need to understand that what the politicians call success and what we call success is not the same thing. When the politicians, when their party is headed for 70%, 80% of the vote, they think they are being successful. But in the process of them saying they are successful, you are losing your freedom. I mean, we went through that. If you read the documents of the Broeder Bond, for instance, and the power that the guys were deployees of the Broeder Bond, and what the Broeder Bond and Boss and all that did to white people in South Africa who differed with them, then you'd have a different point of view. And when I read the Harvard report recently, one of the problems I had with some of the conclusions was that actually there's something that people don't understand, that black professionals, including myself and my brothers, I have two brothers in business, private business, we have been brutalized financially by the ANC. Some of you think that the policies and practices of the ANC favor black people. They've done more harm to people that I know, highly educated people, cowering them, beating them down into submission, that out of sheer hunger you will do anything and everything that the ANC demands. Otherwise they bankrupt you. So that is the type of problems that when I talk about absolutism, that, for instance, the Harvard report talks about black economic empowerment and all these things. Some of those things that were done in the name of empowerment were actually objects of the gangster state that hammered black people, that hammered white people. And there were white people and multinational corporations today who are part of the gangster state and the mafia state. So, my view is that we've got to find our freedom as people and forget about this thing that I am a DA, I am white, I am black. Find your freedom as a constitutional entity yourself that must have human rights, unrestricted human rights for yourself. Thank you.
Now, Sandile, you immediately sort of leading into something that we've spoken about a lot on the State of the Nation, and I know the last time I had Chris on and David and Sarah who came in, I've been quite vocal on the role of business in South Africa, especially recently when business announced that they were going to work with government, right, in fixing the state. And I have and will continue, and I've got an event lined up, hopefully with an interview lined up, hopefully with somebody where I will hold them to account again. But can we talk about the destructive role of business? Chris, you surely see it. I mean, I know we've got ports that are not really working, but corporate South Africa, they seem to be pretty comfortable with the setup at the moment. I mean, we do have down the road over here, you know, that the wonderful Adrian Gore, who by all accounts should be losing the most out of NHI, being the most vocal supporter. Tell us what you think about the role of business, you know, in our whole decline in South Africa.
I tend to get quite nervous when big business and big corporates get in the room together. When they get in the room together, the incentives are higher for them to raise the barriers to competition. They can dictate then what regulatory change happens. What then is the way forward with policy, for example? So, and this is across the board, no matter which political party is then in power at that moment. If you can get the ear of the politicians and you decide in this particular department, this happens, that happens, etc. We've seen this with the localization master plans. The minutes of those meetings are not published. Who gets to be in the room? Who gets to decide what a tariff is on a certain good that is imported? Who gets to decide who benefits from that or not? So at the moment, as we see the role of the state changing, regardless of the political constellation, where the state is becoming a bit more ineffective, where there's fiscal constraints, there's skills constraints, in that void is going to emerge different players. Now it'll be political parties vying for that, civil society, businesses, and one needs to raise the red flags of what then is the reform that happens. So now before the elections, as you say, big business gets in the room with government, they talk about fixing the ports, electricity, fighting corruption. But what comes after that? Is it just a plaster on it before the elections and things look good, or are you changing fundamental policy and regulations to put yourself on a better footing going forward? So just because the focus of our ire is often, for example, the ANC, that doesn't mean you don't also question on what terms do businesses, no matter what size, engage with the government. What concessions do you demand? What requirements do you demand? On whose terms and on whose turf are you just engaging the whole time? Are you just playing the short-term extractive patronage game, or are you trying to set things up in a better way going forward? And I think that's very real to raise at this point in time, given, as I mentioned, the changing role of the state and what could fill that void. A clear example of the negatives is the coal mafias, the construction mafias, who are starting to fill some of those voids and those roles. How to combat effectively against those, because that possibility remains that they entrench themselves even more, and it looks like the veneer of the state functions, but underneath it remains entrenched patronage.
Now, you know, I was thinking about something, because obviously a question I get asked a lot is, do I think that there's any chance that elections could be rigged? And the pithy answer would be, this is a government that can't keep the lights on. Never mind rigging an election, which takes a little bit of organization, and usually
makes me feel a lot better, thanks.
Does make you, yeah, the one upside to the downside. You know, and when you look at say Zimbabwe, where they've been great at rigging elections, they did that. You know, that was planned before they were even in electoral trouble. They kept the army well fed and well paid, and the same with the police, which this party failed to do. However, there's a concern that I have. There was the last by-election we had in KZN was suddenly won by a suspiciously high margin by the ANC, and that was down in the South Coast, right? Having just had all these setbacks in KZN. And one starts wondering whether you might not have those mafias, be they construction, but let's call them, what do they call them, business councils or whatever, right? These are, basically they are, you know, the old style mafia racket. They run this town, therefore you will listen to me and we'll be cut into every deal. But do you think there's a chance, Prince, that these business councils, construction mafia, etc., especially in a place like KZN, where even the beheaded Becky Taylor is too scared to go, do you think these guys could influence the election?
No.
That's on.
No, I don't think so. Look, you can do that kind of thing in a small locality somewhere. You can't do it on a national scale. If you want to do it on a national scale, you have to be a massive institution. So in South Africa, I don't think we have reached the level
organization that the mafiosi in Italy, for example, has reached, where they can influence the entire state system. So I don't think that the construction mafias have that capacity, number one. Number two, rigging elections in South Africa is complicated. It's complicated business. It's very easy in Zim. In Zim, this is how it works. You vote here. That's where you vote, that's not where your votes are going to be counted. They will be transported to a counting center. Before they reach the counting center, something happens. So what is counted is not what was picked up somewhere. In South Africa, that's not how we do business in terms of elections. We vote, where we vote, that's where we count, in the presence of party agents representing all the parties that are taking part in that election, number one. Number two, even the IEC, by the way, the IEC is not, the ANC has power in appointing executives of the IEC. But it's not as if those executives run the show to the extent that everyone who works in the IEC would take instruction and say, let's rig. I don't think that will work. There are many officials of the IEC who actually want the ANC to lose, or who want the DA to win, or the EFF. So there's no, the IEC, you can't use it as an institution to rig an election. There would be a rebellion internally. The last thing is this, which is very strange. There are many people in the ANC who want the ANC to lose. And this is what people, I mean, Kgalema Motlanthe has been hinting that the ANC will learn when it loses. There are many people in the ANC who want their party to lose the elections next year. So even the ANC can't be united in rigging an election.
Just while we stay with that, you spoke about the, you know, the potential of your scenario one of the ANC, that the DA may be licking their lips at absorbing the ANC, and similarly in your second scenario that the EFF are licking their lips. I couldn't help thinking that, isn't it possible that both scenarios come true? Right? That in actual fact, you know, there are kind of two ANCs at the moment.
Look, what I think will happen is that there are two ANCs with regard to these scenarios I'm talking about. There's an ANC that wants the EFF scenario. There is. And as I suggested, Paul is a leader of that ANC. But there's also another ANC that wants the DA. As I suggested, Cyril is part of that ANC. So the ANC that is going to have its way is going to anger the other ANC. And that other ANC will be defeated if the Cyril Ramaphosa ANC gets its way. But it won't be happy. So as a result, they will be fermenting an internal rebellion. So whoever is going to lead that coalition on the part of the ANC will not be popular within the ANC. That is going to lead to the demise of the party. Which is why the calculation on the part of either the EFF or the DA is that once we capture the ANC, it will start fighting and it will eat itself up. That's what is going to happen. So if the ANC gets 36% next year, in 2029 it will get 20% or 18%. If you think I'm smoking something, look at the ANC's decline in the Western Cape. Once it starts declining, the thing just goes into a tailspin. It never comes back, and it will not come back.
Yeah. That's because they rely so heavily on patronage.
Exactly. I mean, they need patronage, and once you take the state patronage from them, now, they will scatter.
Yeah, Sandile, I saw you nodding in approval. This decline of the ANC, do you buy it? Don't worry, they're controlling you from...
Okay, oh, okay, thank you. You know, I'll tell you a little story about this issue. One of my former students was actually a very senior member of the South African Communist Party. And he was based in the Western Cape. Remember that in the Western Cape, part of the problems that happened is that they fought with Rasool. They got rid of Rasool. And the faction that supported Rasool actually started working with the DA to undermine the ANC. So the ANC in the Western Cape actually actively undermined the ANC in the Western Cape. It has already happened. What Michelle is talking about has already happened, and we've seen it. Interestingly, the very same people, the same person, was a very active member over a long time, supporting the Zuma faction and the re-election of Zuma, election of Zuma in Polokwane and re-election of Zuma in Mangaung. So the ANC is, right today, that person is working to undermine the current regime. So if you want to talk about political chaos, it's the ANC. And that internal chaos and disloyalty and divisions is going to accelerate now, because what they also do is that once they fight with you, they start trying to undermine your bread and butter. And in desperation also people fight, and fight desperately. So there are bitter fights that are going on even as we speak.
Now, while all of these fights take place, obviously it comes at a cost. We do understand, you know, we lived through the early 90s and the move to the new South Africa, but at that point in time, there was a big economy. The world was a little bit of a different place. There was a little bit of a pot of gold at the end of that particular rainbow of that fight, and that was, we had a thriving mining industry. We were the gateway to Africa. There was a way to see that it was worth this pain, this fight, because at the end of this all, South Africa could become a more prosperous, or should become a more prosperous country after years of isolation. But it feels to me that these political fights that we're having, and these fights over control, etc., are having the effect. You know, we as Chris pointed out, you know, you've got ports with, you know, where now certain companies dropping containers off in Mauritius and saying, go and fetch them there, right? And it's literally undermining investment and prosperity in South Africa. So this isn't a fight for the spoils. This is a fight that's destroying the economy. Prince, what do you make of it?
Yeah, look, here's the thing. The fight is a fight for useless spoils. Let me put it that way. As they fight for useless spoils, they have forgotten the economy. Believe it or not, they are making a bit of money in the process, in the course of this fight. Paul Mashatile is living in a super millionaire mansion. He doesn't care that the port of Durban doesn't work, that Richards Bay there's chaos. He looks at his personal circumstances, he's having a good time. And that's the logic that is driving the parasites in the ANC. It's actually primitive accumulation. No one is thinking about the functioning of the country. They have forgotten that, but they are focusing on, and they are making a bit of money.
So for the time being, Paul Mashatile lives in his son's 36 million rand mansion. Yeah, you can't make that stuff up. Chris, you do a lot of consulting to a lot of international people and companies. Now, just recently we had Volkswagen basically saying, shape up or we are shipping out. Are you getting that sense from a lot of those companies that are invested in South Africa?
At the very least, more questions are being asked than were before. And them trying to use their voice, as it were, so not just wanting to negotiate with government on operating, but maybe setting the stall out and saying, this is how things are looking. After 5 years, we're going to have to shift. We're seeing a bit more protectionist policy around the world, more stronger industrial policy, countries like the US implementing subsidies, bringing those manufacturing and supply chains back, quote unquote. That means South Africa could benefit from the moving of those supply chains, again, if we set ourselves up in the right sort of policy framework. But for the time being, the companies with which we engage, they're starting to ask more and more questions, which in and of itself creates uncertainty and doubt. And you don't, in that global context of, as I mentioned, high interest rates, tighter capital flows, the capital would rather go somewhere else versus here. So the more barriers you have, capital like a river, like water flows along the path of least resistance. we're raising more barriers of resistance for that capital to come here. I'm not saying anyone is going to exit overnight, but they're starting to ask questions. And just on a last point on Volkswagen and a few other mining companies in the last week, Anglo are raising questions. Apparently with Anglo, government has engaged with them and asked them to hold off on any layoffs. So even from government side, they're asking, just delay it, just wait a little bit. But the pressure accelerates and the pressure mounts, and there are more and more sort of cracks in the dam wall, as it were.
Now, I mentioned earlier about the fact that back in the early 90s, there was, one of the stories was, that was, one of the, let's put it this way, one of the reasons to get the negotiations done was the potential of South Africa being the gateway to Africa. Now we might find ourselves in a slightly different position, and that is that some African countries are actually getting their shit together. Countries like Kenya, Rwanda, right? And we look at on the financial side, Mauritius, etc. They have eaten our lunch. Are you, they must start becoming a company like VW. They want to be on the African continent. It's a growth area, but there's no God-given right for that to be in South Africa as we got used to it over the years. That might just go up the road and it'll be a bit easier if they do it in Kenya. Are you getting that from your clients?
Yeah, the trend line is in that direction. So with that being said, South Africa is still the strongest developed economy on the continent, the strongest infrastructure. If you can get some of the small wins right, you create the positive momentum. It's easy in our risk analysis and correct to highlight the major policy risks, but on the positive side, it's that untapped potential. So the demographic dividend, the potential of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Given how much growth there can and should be in sub-Saharan Africa when the rest of the world is going to encounter the problems of aging populations, geopolitical conflict and tensions, countries like VW and others, South African companies, they still want their bases to be here and to manufacture here. They're just, I think, because they're raising the red flags now is because they're so invested, because they want things to work here. Whether they realize maybe you should start moving past government in certain ways or not, and if that takes too long, that's a different question. But no one is going to just leave overnight. It's a process. It happens over time. Nothing falls apart overnight. I'm not going to tell you South Africa is a failed state today. I see it much more on a spectrum, and we can still shift it back towards the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, one of the things that always astounds me is that the calculation never seems to be made about the, if you want to call it the social side, and that is that many of those companies want to be here because their representatives can live here, go to a decent restaurant or go to the movies or go to a shopping center or whatever. The lifestyle is still fine if you're an international executive, right? And, when you start degrading the lifestyle of living in South Africa, then suddenly the idea of perhaps if I'm going to be in a compound in Port Elizabeth, I might as well be in a compound in Mombasa, it's the same thing. That never seems to enter into any discussion within the ANC. I've never ever heard a discussion in ANC language that talks to lifestyle. I've only heard about failures, privilege, problems, votes. I've never heard about the fact that the one thing that South Africa does have to offer has historically been quite a nice lifestyle for people that live here, and that leads to wealth. Sandile, in all your years, when you were still in the WhatsApp group, because I know you're a bit out, but did any of the comrades ever talk about the fact that, make it quite pleasant for people and they might want to be here and spend their money?
Yeah, I think that I want to emphasize this point that we need to, as we speak here and engage, our aim must be to educate the leadership class, the leading class, not just the ANC or whoever, a political party. And I'm saying this for a reason. Part of the issues that I was fighting about with my ward councillor are dumping, dumping, people coming to dump, and then this thing needs to be attended to. Then I report it to the ward committee, report it to the ward councillor. And that dumping by the way, probably 4 months, 6 months down the road, is still lying there. That got me kicked out of the WhatsApp group. And my ward councillor is a white DA lady. She stays walking distance from my house. So the idea of quality of life needs to enter our leadership thinking across the board. The idea, for instance, of people challenging our title deeds. I've been involved in a fight on land invasion. I've just finished fighting 18 harassment cases against people who opened cases against me, were invading my land. I was subjected to an assault with the intention to cause grievous bodily harm, hit on the head with a spade by land invaders, and so on, litigation. And the councillors and the mayor are supporting these people. So the idea of a quality of life is an idea that we need to introduce, that we need to live in clean places, we need to live, regardless whether it's the EFF, the DA, and our title deeds must be respected. It needs to cut across everywhere.
But don't you think that, I could not agree with you more, do you not think that that discussion needs to start across the board? And I know, I mean, you've said it, but you know, that sort of goes into a whole lot of places, because I mean, you know, many of the people sitting here today, there's been a constant, if I could put it, disrespect for the lifestyle that we would lead. You know, you're privileged because you live in this nice white suburb, and it's spoken of as if you've committed some kind of crime to pay good money, the going rate for your house, and pay your bond and pay your taxes. And it's spoken of with deep disrespect by the government, by the opposition, and by analysts. I've had enough people on my show that come along and talk about privilege as if it's some kind of a really bad thing, unearned, you know, given to me. You know, I recently had somebody up there, I said, yeah, you know, all whites get together every week, we just hand out the money. You know, it doesn't work that way. Surely that respect has to cut across completely from, you know, it just has to be one of those things we start respecting in the country.
Yeah. You see, there's a measure of dishonesty that has come into South Africa. First of all, I don't subscribe to this idea of privileged and underprivileged. I think that thinking is wrong. Because if I've got the basics that a human being should have to live, then I'm called privileged, right? I have an in-suite bathroom, I have a garage where I park my car, and so on. And to me, that's a good quality of life, and you call it a privilege, arbitrarily so. Secondly, I lived in Pondoland from about 1972 to 75 in the Eastern Cape, on my grandfather's farm, in a traditional farm, given to him under Pondo law. The land was there, the orchards were there, the tree plantations were there, everything was there. And there was nobody squatting on anybody's land. You got the land through proper channels. So this idea that there are privileged people whose land must be dispossessed is a false idea. It's not part of African law, it's not part of African philosophy, it's not part of African culture. It's actually a fraudulent scheme.
Yeah, look, there are two things here. Number one, it's hypocrisy. If you look at the person who is accusing white people of white privilege, most likely that person lives with white people. Most likely. You can take Malema. Malema doesn't live in some run-down shanty town. No, the fellow lives here. He lives here. His kids go to school here with white kids. So the first thing, it's hypocrisy. The second thing to explain this, they know, the politicians, the ANC politicians, the EFF politicians, that they have actually lost touch with what they call the masses of our people. So in order for them to maintain some kind of contact, they need to stand on a stage and be seen to be championing the interests of the people. So the people must see them as if these are our representatives who are raising our issues. The last thing is about the ANC, this is specific about the ANC. The ANC is a party that has gone mad. You see, the fact that they're still in government, it gives them some decency. People still take them seriously. This is a party that has completely gone bonkers. Everyone there is trying to grab whatever they grab. They know, by the way, they are getting out of power. And there is no, I mean, what do you remember from the latest policy conference of the ANC? The ANC can no longer think. The proper thinking class has long exited the ANC, such as him.
Kicked out of the WhatsApp group. While we're talking about going bonkers and the ANC, let's talk about our international policies. Because, you know, I mean, it's just something that I'm completely confused by. I did write a mischievous article where I said that it's amazing that ever since we started to support Russia and now Hamas, the ANC no longer has a problem paying salaries. Right? What do you think at this stage informs our foreign policy? Does it make any sense to you? Do you have any idea what informs our foreign policy in South Africa?
There is no foreign policy in South Africa. It's bottom line. Cyril Ramaphosa, I don't think he has attended any class where they teach foreign policy. I have, by the way, and I've taught foreign policy at university. The chap has no clue what is foreign policy. This is how you test, and this sounds like this chap is bizarre. When you want to test the understanding of foreign policy on the part of a president, look at the first country that he visits. Because you use that to make a statement to the world. There's something you want to use that as a platform to make a statement to the world, number one. Number two, you present a speech on foreign policy and tell us, here are the pillars of foreign policy, South Africa's foreign policy. And the tone is set by the president, by the way. It's not set by the foreign minister. Foreign policy, it's actually the domain of the president. Does any one of you here remember a speech by Cyril Ramaphosa setting out the contours of our foreign policy? No. Difficult to remember, right? Just go check, Google, where his first visit when he became president. You realize this fellow has no idea what is foreign policy. The chap and his government, I mean, the Minister of Foreign Policy, I mean, Naledi Pan, in all seriousness, is there someone who thinks that that is a foreign policy material? Half of the time she's asleep because she's old. She's old. When she's not old, there's a younger minister who takes over, the spokesperson of foreign policy, called Mkhumbudzo Chabeni. I mean, she's an embarrassment. I mean, Mkhumbudzo Chabeni is an embarrassment. This is a minister in the presidency. So, to answer your question, the statements that are made occasionally about Russia, about Palestine, Israel, serious thinking people in the world should not take them seriously, because there is no coherent framework called South Africa's foreign policy that has been articulated by anybody. They keep on contradicting each other.
But even that incoherence, that adds to our risk and our perceptions, because no one knows who to talk to and who to engage with on foreign policy. So even that, you undermine yourself in not sticking to a particular line. So if you then talked about non-alignment and you practice non-alignment, that would give you even more weight on the international sphere, I think. I think there's a bit of a longer game at play here as well, not to give them too much credit, but shifting a bit more towards the orbit of Russia and China, because you're worried in your fiscal environment around your fiscal crunch and if you will continue to get investment and possible bailouts from the IMF and the World Bank. Shift yourself to a different orbit and you put yourself in better stall for that in the longer term. So it's not just Russia now, short term. Yes, that's the current conflict. But you want to shift closer to the so-called Sino world and you put yourself in better stall, then you de-risk yourself from the West maybe.
Chris, I agree with you. I did spend some time at the, it's like one of those things, and you don't want to say it too loudly, but I did spend some time here at the BRIC summit, where it was almost embarrassing to see the way that we were behaving in South Africa. But certainly, I agree with you. It does look like we're moving towards that orbit. Do you think that have you seen any evidence that China likes to give money without any, sort of repayment terms, because that's the way it feels like we're hoping.
I mean, for any investor, whether it's an individual or a country, if you are taking a higher punt with higher risk, you will demand higher concessions. So for the time being, the practice, the talk from China has been, the strings are pretty loose. We're going to build a port for you. We won't take that port. But in a country like Zambia, especially, where investment projects, infrastructure projects have happened, and there's issues around debt repayment, China is starting to ramp up the pressure a little bit. So there isn't a clear example as yet, but the rhetoric has shifted. Given China's internal challenges at the moment, and given that President Xi Jinping and the Politburo, etc., they're turning a bit more inward. You've got various purges happening after the policy conference earlier this year. I don't see that agility that you've seen from the Chinese economy beforehand. They'll still get between maybe 3 and 5% growth. We would be grateful for that. But for them, that's not what they're used to. That puts more pressure on them internally, which in terms of their foreign policy has knock-on effects. That ramps up then the possibility they don't invest as much as they have on the African continent.
Yeah, it does seem to me that there's a bit of Cold War thinking here, that in the name of the Cold War, because you're not those guys, but you're those guys, that you'll get stuff for free. Sandile, our foreign policy, you impressed with it? Is that another WhatsApp group you kicked out of?
Yeah, so, no, I'm in on this one. The thing about it is this. Let's say we were doing it correctly. Then we would know what our national interest is. Not the interest of the DA, not the interest of the ANC or the interest of the EFF, the interest of South Africa. And then when you engage on that basis. And this is the difficult part. And this difficult part cannot be divorced, by the way. I mean, you might think Mashele is actually mischievous. The ANC has been deprived of intellectual capacity. This thing that I'm saying sounds simple, but if you don't know how to sit down and go through disciplined thinking to define your national interest, then you're going to have a problem. The second one, which ties in with yours, Chris, is that in history, because we've studied even European history, Europe has been prone to war, but there are nations that have maintained neutrality. It's possible, UK is possible to maintain neutrality. It's not wrong. Switzerland and others have maintained neutrality. So to be non-aligned and neutral is possible, but it must be aligned to your national interest, and it must be consistent neutrality under all conditions and circumstances, and so on and so forth. So, for instance, I mean, I got a call from DERCO, They got a letter from the US, United States of America, about all this list of names of people that were blacklisted by the US, and that if you do business with these people, this and this will happen to you by the US. And it came from the Minister of Finance in the US. So now they want to understand this, and they called me to come and explain and discuss this thing with them. I went there, and I discovered that these chaps are actually learning something out of this. Now that is worrisome. That they are full-time diplomats. I do governance studies across the board. I do risk assessment across the board. They are specialists in this part, and they are learning from me. I said, this is a problem. Now I'm a quarterly visitor there. I'm in the WhatsApp group.
I'm not in that WhatsApp group. As you can imagine.
I had to say it was quite cute when he said that you may think that Mr. Mashele is being mischievous. I know he's being mischievous. But, I don't know if there's questions that are coming from the audience. I'd love to hear somebody else's voice. I'll come to you in a second. In fact, let's just move across, because what I've got over here, ladies and gentlemen, so it's time for you to start. We're now going to start getting serious here, because we've got the Australian High Commission here. Now, at the count of 3, we're going to start throwing bread rolls. Because we're very jealous of the Australian High Commission. But I really do think of something when I think of Australia. We know we're very jealous of Australia, and some of our best family and friends have moved there and so on and so forth, and they tell us how wonderful it is all the time and all of that stuff. But at least we beat them at rugby. But they do consistently beat us at cricket. Now just think about this. I want to give you 2 cricket stories. I'm an old cricket fan. I played a little bit. Now, I want to give you 2 stories. One comes from the 80s and one comes from the early 90s, just to give some idea of the depths to which South Africa has plummeted. In the mid-80s, South Africa had a rebel cricket series. We were isolated from international sport, and we decided to have, well, you know, they're not going to let us play official tests. We'll buy the players. We weren't just going to buy the players, we were going to buy the entire test team to come and play here. And Australia, the world's leading cricket country, and has been, I'm not going to say that in front of the Australian High Commission, Australia have been the bellwether for cricket for 150 years. We bought the entire test team to come and play here. Australia could do nothing about it. They didn't have the money to keep their own players. We could afford to buy their entire team. Can you comprehend where we were in 1985 compared to where Australia was? Now look at them, right? That's how far we've fallen. Think about something else. In 1991, South Africa was suddenly back in international cricket. And we decided that there was an opportunity to make our first trip to India, where we went and played 3 one-day matches in India. And South Africa were the hot new property. We were allowed back into cricket. Life was wonderful. India couldn't afford to host us. India, just let this sink in for a minute, couldn't afford to fly 1 team of cricketers to India, sell out a stadium, broadcast it. Anybody who would remember, the broadcast was too terrible. They didn't have sponsors. All the sponsors around the ground were South African companies, right? India couldn't afford to sponsor 1 team for 3 one-day matches in India. Now India runs a multi-billion-dollar cricketing franchise around the world. And South Africa have to dance to their tune. While we are worried about all sorts of other bullshit, but our economy is that poor compared to where it was. That's in 30 years, that's in my lifetime, right? And many people here, their lifetimes. Please understand where we were and where we are. And, you know, it's just an astounding thing. Well, now that I've said my say, I saw that a hand went up by, and I'm going to give the microphone to the Australian High Commissioner so that you know exactly where to throw those bread rolls for beating us at the World Cup.
Thank you, Mike. Well, we are the world's best fielding team, so I might just catch them. But look, thank you for spending so much time on the cricket. It almost, in my heart, made up for the rugby. Almost. I have 2 questions. Thank you for the invitation. Very much enjoyed the panel. So my role as an ambassador and the role of diplomats is sort of twofold. The first, which is really obvious, is to advocate for your country, to advance the interests of your country. But the second role, which is something that happens quietly and behind the scenes, is to analyse what's going on where you are and advise your government on what it means for them. So I'm trying to understand this country. I've been here since January. I'm enjoying it very much. Chris, the way you explained South African foreign policy reflects, I think, what a lot of diplomats in Pretoria are feeling, which is that it's a bit confused. So there are contradictory messages on everything from Ukraine to Israel, but particularly on the economy, on the role of the private sector, on the role of trade. I guess what I'm trying to understand is that, is there a political purpose served by those different messages on those issues? And this is something that your colleagues on the stage may have a view about too. Is it on purpose? Does it serve a purpose in terms of a pressure valve for different constituencies? And it matters because we need to be able to identify what the policy is and who makes the policy. Now, Princess just said there's no foreign policy, which I can't tell my capital that. I have to find the locus. I think, Sandile, your point about interests is spot on, because your foreign policy should reflect your interests. And it's not always easy, it's very hard. And I think Australia works very hard to sort of find our place in the world. in our region. So first question, is it on purpose, these different messages? Second question, chaos for the next 10 years. I think that was you, Prince, which suggests it's going to get worse before it gets better. Can we assume it's going to get better? And the reason I ask this, and Mike, you made a comment about it's not the 90s anymore, although the fashion's coming back, have you noticed? Is there, you know, the 90s was a very different period in terms of where power was in the world, and the world now is a bit of a mess. Can we assume it will get better at the other end? Thank you.
On the foreign policy and the interest and the power bases, I think because you don't have, from the top down, a clear idea and a clear coherence, then you've got a contestation and playing to interest and power groups and power bases. And that's also in the context of declining support for the ANC. So to set yourself up in a better stall going forward, you need to establish your power base, as it were. Premier Lesufi is doing it in Gauteng with the crime prevention wardens. He's trying to realize there's an issue around crime, maybe not the best way to deal with it, but he's trying to own that, as it were, set himself up better going forward. There's issues between the ANC provincially and nationally. Do they work with the EFF or not? It's about establishing your local provincial power base more and not worrying so much about the diktats from maybe the NEC, for example. So with foreign policy, I don't think it's on purpose. I think it's more a result of the pressures within the party and within government. Lack of skills, financial pressures. You're going to have reallocation of budgets, our debt to GDP ratio approaching 77%. That means you've got cuts on certain things, not that allocation of resources that you had before. So I realize that pragmatism isn't a principle, but that might well be what dominates South African foreign policy for the time being. But also I think globally that is becoming a bit of a trend. Those middle powers, we talk about the global south, I think that's too easy of a term, a catch-all term. More emerging powers, they're not putting themselves clearly in either the China or US camp. It's becoming more transactional. Foreign policy is becoming more transactional, more win-win, what can I get out of it, more short-termist. That makes it more difficult to predict and deal with. But that is the world I think that we're emerging into now. We talked about in South Africa how you don't have the central force that is the ANC, or the ANC has been. Same thing globally. Maybe a new central force will emerge, maybe not. But within that is increased uncertainty and anxiety. So I know that's not the easy answer, but that's the difficulty I think we're going to have to deal with for the time being.
Yeah, Ambassador, I'm very sorry, I don't wish I were in your position. It's very difficult to find something that doesn't exist. You see, by the way, it's not as if one hates or dislikes the ANC and no. The ANC at some point was a proper government of South Africa. Let's start there. There was a time when the ANC was a proper government of South Africa. Under Nelson Mandela, the ANC was a proper government of South Africa. And it actually had a foreign policy. It was not difficult to find. You knew where South Africa stood on which issue. And by the way, there was an overarching framework that was written down, thought through from a policy conference, and it became a state instrument. That used to be the ANC when it was still, before it went mad. Even under Thabo Mbeki, by the way, I would argue that the best times of the ANC in terms of foreign policy were actually under Thabo Mbeki. He had a very clearly articulated foreign policy that was Africa-centered. He mobilized the whole of the continent behind a continental agenda. You remember the whole NEPAD, APRM architecture. South Africa was, even at the time, by the way, a few African countries would be invited to G8 summits to provide an African input. So there was a time when South Africa had a foreign policy under the ANC. Zuma also had semblances of foreign policy. By the way, this whole BRICS shift to BRICS, it was actually a Zuma policy, it was not Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa just jumped on the bandwagon. He's going hither and thither. So let me park the foreign policy question on there. Could it be better? The DA strategy, in my view, and I'm an analyst, is to capture the ANC as it dies, and capture the state and halt the decline. Once they get into the union buildings, then you halt the decline and you redirect the state. I think that's what they're trying to do. If they were to succeed working with progressive elements in the ANC supporting that agenda, it could be better before it gets worse. But it will depend on the pushback of the losers, because there will be losers from the ANC. And they will shake the tree for the monkeys to fall. Depending on how violently they shake the tree, do the monkeys fall or not? So it will depend on that contest. And if the winners have the strength and they work with the DA under that scenario, we could address the decline. If you were to have the EFF ANC scenario, that's a scenario that we call in our book, God Help Us.
High Commissioner, what I would say, just as a starting point, that in the next 8 months, you probably have a more than 90% chance that the ANC will not have as much power as it is. Now, to the extent, for instance, that they supporting, seemingly supporting Hamas, stuff like that, or supporting Russia, or whatever it is they're doing. And then their potential partner, the DA, supporting the opposite. And these chaps are going to lose power. And these two are going to be partners. There's going to be turbulence between these two to cancel those policies, or to change this way or that way. Let's say from August going forward next year. So it matters. There are people who are working for the DA-ANC coalition. If you get that, part of the negotiations will be foreign policy negotiation, a pro-Western type policy, and there are people, the Mavuso Msimangs of this world and so on, who are working on that. They are working on that. There are people in the ANC actively working for the DA solution to come about, just as well as their EFF ones. Thank you.
Right.
Good morning. Sorry. Thank you very much. The talks today have been absolutely insightful and things. My question is primarily aimed at Chris, but to the panel in general as well. It's regarding South Africa's foreign policy, once again. You said earlier that we are within South Africa in a time of realignment, but I think globally you also have that realignment starting with the Russia-Ukraine war. And perhaps case in point proven by the esteemed ambassador from Australia is, if you have a look at what the ANC's been saying when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, and recently giving a terrorist organization a call back for funsies, these are incidents that our Western trading partners are viewing. And it seems to be that they're very confused as to where exactly we are going. My question is, at what point does America and the West give up on South Africa and the ANC? And what would that look like? So, thank you.
I don't think that point materializes, given the country's weight on the continent still. We say, oh, South Africa acts in its own interest with foreign policy, wanting to get investment or funds from Russia. Every country acts for its self-interest, or tries to, within certain bounds of norms and rules and such. So the US wants to increase its influence on the African continent. They, maybe too late, they realized that they seriously dropped the ball on Africa in terms of just thinking foreign aid is the best way to develop economies, for example, thinking you just throw money at a quote-unquote problem, you don't engage with people on the ground with their challenges, their issues. As China and Russia have done a little bit better. I mean, Russia, through its proxy, the Wagner Group, has moved into fill a void that is being left on the continent. We're seeing the negative effects of that. So I think the US will want, just for its own economic benefits for trade, something like the Africa Free Trade Area, want to put itself in better stall going forward. So engage with the South African government where it can, maybe ask questions here and there. You had Ambassador Brigitte making the allegations earlier this year. That was the equivalent of throwing a grenade into the room. You don't see that in sort of diplomatic conduct, but I think the sort of line from Washington was, do something that radical to see what the reaction is. We can't then necessarily, you had issues around the inquiry, what evidence was provided or not, but the point was, measure the temperature in the room. And to them, they've been largely satisfied. To give President Ramaphosa and his administration some kind of credit, you had the inquiry, you can ask questions about the process, but the steps were then followed. So you've started to practice a little bit more your non-alignment. You're saying, we take your concerns seriously, we're going to investigate it, etc., etc. So I think South Africa has done okay to assuage some of the concerns. The issue is more on a spectrum. So the US won't totally disinvest, won't give the marching orders to companies, but you're seeing the realignment of supply chains and value chains. And generally, you're going to want those supply chains and value chains to be in less risky places, less risky environments. And that might then not be South Africa to the extent that it has been up until now. Same thing for the European Union. For them, heavily reliant on trade with China, even not more so than the US, but very much in terms of consumption, manufacturing. For them as well, they're asking questions about South Africa and those manufacturing hubs, Volkswagen being the latest example.
Prince, you.
The US is showing serious cracks itself as a governance system. I mean, we are all watching. So the idea of the old coherent US, where there is no difference between a Republican president and a Democratic president when it comes to fundamentals of foreign policy, I think that is beginning to show a bit of cracks. So we need to factor that into the equation when we think of what will be the US coordinated approach towards South Africa. That's number one. Number two, this assumed worry on the part of Western countries that arises from South Africa's shift towards the East, we need to think a little bit more carefully about it, because it's Neil Ferguson, right, who coined the neologism chimerica, to explain the depth of economic integration and dependency between the US and China. And it's real, that phenomenon. So it's not as if the West does not want to do business or doesn't do business with China. American companies, talk to Elon Musk and his Tesla and look at what he's doing. He does frequent China, because even the West does business and will continue to do business with China. So it's not as if South Africa's shift, if it were to be coherent and thought through, would be different fundamentally from what the West is doing. Even, as you correctly said, the EU does business with China. And China is poised to be probably the biggest economy in the world over the next 15, 20 years. Maybe that is too long a projection.
Right, we're going to take a last question from the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, David Ansara. David.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to the panel. Mike mentioned earlier the role of business in this context, and we've seen, particularly throughout this year, the social compacting model coming to the fore, the partnership initiative, hundreds of CEOs lending their support to business to try and address some of the critical challenges that we're facing. You've mentioned the ports, electricity, crime syndicates, and so on. But our argument as the Free Market Foundation is that this essentially doesn't address the core underlying problems, which are policy-driven, and that there are no concessions being demanded from business. I think Chris mentioned this earlier as being an absent feature. So if you look at the National Health Insurance proposal, for example, there were over 100 submissions made by various civil society and business actors during the parliamentary legislative drafting process. The bill has remained unchanged, entirely unchanged. And throughout, if you look at the last few months, we're now on the verge of the bill being passed by the National Council of Provinces. And we have senior business leaders like Martin Kingston saying, well, no, don't worry, there's still a chance the president might not sign it. Whereas a few weeks ago he was saying, well, no, we're confident that Section 33 of the Act will be removed. None of those assurances have been met. So our argument as the Free Market Foundation is that big business needs to recognize its significant bargaining power and stop supporting the government, particularly on an eve of an election, a very critical election, and withdraw its support from particularly some of these social compacting initiatives, partnership initiatives. And if they are going to provide support, they must demand policy concessions. So get EWC off of the table, remove NHI, and liberalize the kind of network industries like electricity and transport. I'm curious to hear what the panel thinks of that position.
I thought he was going to take it. He's throwing it in my direction. I don't know why, but look, if you look at the history of business in its engagement with the state in South Africa over a long period of time, certain attributes emerge. Whether you're looking at the period when the English were still in charge, you had your Cecil John Rhodes and the guys who ran the mining industry, your Alfred Byte and them, literally in cahoots with those who ran the government. The same applies when you jump to post-1948. Those who ran the state and those who were in business were in the main in cahoots. When 1994 happened, those who ran business, who in the main were white, they realized there's a black government coming on board here. We must start getting closer to these fellows. And they designed BE schemes and all sorts of stuff to get closer to, and enriched a few of these fellows, Cyril Ramaphosa and them. So the approach has been proximity, be close to the government, to the government. That has been the approach. And that approach hasn't changed. That script is still the same. Now, the ideal approach, if you were to ask me, would be that of independence. Business being independent, looking after your interests. Don't support the state. Support your interests and bargain. Where you think that the state is undermining your interests, if you have an independent posture, you would be able to speak against what the government is doing in the state. But if you have been supportive, you are scared to speak, and that's the tricky space that business finds itself now. It can see that the whole thing is collapsing. Those who are in charge of the state, they are running the entire country aground. But they can't speak up because they have been buddy-buddy in their attitude and in the way they engage with those who are in government. So, if there are business people here, I assume there are many. Think about that.
Can I just say something? I just want to make this point on this issue that you are raising. That, just raise it, it's on. Okay, thank you, Mike. Just to raise this issue that there's a difference between economics and business management. Right? Business people run their individual businesses. The economy is a system, and it needs different skills to run the economy. And once you see business people getting into partnership with the government, and you think they are fixing the economy, they are fixing their businesses, they are fixing their money-making schemes, they are not fixing the economy. To back that up, I did not want to go to this, but 2 points. Number one, during apartheid, Milton Friedman, I'm sure you know him, was trying to address the problem of inflation in the mid-70s, South Africa. They paid no attention to him. So the free market guys tried to penetrate South Africa, they didn't succeed. 2, I had a long meeting with Paddy Lehutla, the former statistician general. And the idea of economic planning and modeling the South African economy on the part of the government and the ANC after the Polokwane conference was cancelled. So the modeling of this economy, when they talk about the economy, it's not an economy that they've got full data on. This economy is being driven blind. I consulted to the Gauteng Department of Economic Development. They said to me they've got the model and they have 33% of the data they need to model this economy of Gauteng. So their decisions are thumbsuck. And Mbeki, the reason why I had the meeting with Lekgotla is because Mbeki had said, this is thumbsucking. What is going on here is thumbsucking. These guys are flying the economy in the dark as we speak today. So you must distinguish between what the business plans of individual businesses and the modeling and economic planning of the nation. Those are two different things, and the economy is is flying blind. Maybe the businesses have got business plans, but not the economy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a wonderful morning, and what little is left of our economy, you guys have to go back to try and make it work. So we would stay all day. You see what I have to put up with. Often you watch those interviews, you see 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Let me tell you, often I keep these guys there for another hour, 2 hours. Our record, I think, was 3. So, it gets very interesting. We will continue to get some of these questions answered. We're going to continue to get business to hold them to account, and we've got a very hot interview coming up. Hopefully, as the parties get a little close to elections, we'll get to hear from some of the parties that we like to talk about.